the Quran from it? The answer was no. He couldn't do it. But we can. Just imagine that. I just want everybody to imagine that while we're going through this. Now, another of the biggest claims that skeptics have of the New Testament authors, that the New Testament authors are anonymous. But is this true? And can we know what the early Christians accepted as sacred scripture? Now, Muslims have this thing called a chain of narration. These are stories that are passed down the line, I don't like chain of narration. Us Christians, we have something that is just a bit better. We have a chain of authorship. The chain of authorship is better than the chain of narration. So we would have people like Tertullian of Carthage, Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus of Lyons. We can even go to the Matorian fragment, Justin Martyr, and we can also go all the way back to Papias of Hierapolis. Now, when we get there, you'll understand why. So Tertullian of Carthage lived right around 207. And he says, the Gospels were written by Matthew and John, who were apostles, and Luke and Mark, who were apostolic men. Mark's Gospel is the record of Peter's preaching. So here we have an early church father identifying who the gospel writers are. And it's who we know they are. Now we have Clement of Alexandria, lived roughly around 150 to 215 and wrote right around 180. And he says that Mark wrote his gospel. Now, this is a little controversy. Matthew and Luke were published first, and John's gospel was the last one to appear. A lot of people will say that Mark is the oldest gospel.
Yeah.
But so I'm not going to get into too much in that right now. If you wanted to, I can do a stream later and things to that nature on that. But to me, it really doesn't matter if Matthew or Mark was written first to me. Irenaeus of Lyons, around 180. He lived from 130 to 202. He says that Matthew's gospel was the first one written. That's two. That's two of them saying that. Mark, a disciple of Peter, handed down in his gospel what Peter had preached. Luke, a companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. John, the disciple of the Lord, published a gospel. So far, while we're reading through these names, so far, early Christendom we knew who the gospel writers were. There was no worry about the gospel writers, if they were anonymous or anything else like this. So I have no idea where this is coming from. So we could even go to the Matorian fragment. The Matorian fragment would say that Matthew and Mark and Luke, the physician and the companion of Paul, wrote his gospel, and John, who is an eyewitness, wrote his gospel. Now, when we go back to Justin Martyr, this is back to about 150. He lived from 100 to about 165. He says that the Christians possessed the memoirs of Jesus, which were called the Gospels. These were written by apostles and by those who were their followers. Now, we jump all the way back to Papias of Hierapolis. He lived from 60 to 130. He was taught by the Apostle John. He was the bishop of Hierapolis. Now, let me just read this here for him. Papias of Hierapolis was a bishop of the early church of Eusebius of Caesarea. And Eusebius of Caesarea calls him the bishop of Hierapolis, a city in the region of Asia, which is 6.2 miles or 10 kilometers north of I'm not even going to pronounce that, near the other one. Colossians chapter 4, 12 to 13.
Yeah, Laodicea. I know it's hard to pronounce. Colossae, Laodicea. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. In the northern edge of the Lycus Valley of Asia Minor, it should not be confused with the Hierapolis of Syria. Christianity came to Hierapolis through the efforts of Epaphras, Papias,
Epaphras.
Epaphras. There we go.
Say that 5 times fast.
Papias wrote a 5-volume work entitled An Exposition of the Oracles of the Lord. So Papias was the first to refer to the name of the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, and he wrote that Mark based his gospel on Peter's preaching. Being a student of John, definitely would have known that John would have wrote his gospel as well. So these are the chain of authorship that us Christians have to know who the authors of the gospels are. So we don't worry about these scholars, that the secular scholars that say that they don't know who the gospel writers are. What we need to do is we need to go to the early church fathers, and we need to find out what the early church fathers are saying about the scriptures, who's writing these scriptures. And that's why I call myself a Cathoxidant. I respect my Catholics, my Orthodox, and my Protestant brothers and sisters 100%. I will reach out and hug y'all in one big group, because over in the original Quran-only Christians, we stand for unity in Christ to go after the nastiness of Islam.
That's why I tell you guys, you cannot assume that just because you belong to a church, everyone else is not part of the body of Christ. And I've been on record, and I don't say it to say it. If I didn't believe it, he wouldn't be here. There are true believers, born of the Spirit, filled with the Spirit, in every major branch of Christianity. Evangelicals in the millions who love Christ. The Lord meets you where you're at and sees what you know. But you notice again the connection. You see, he has to go to the church fathers, and he knows their importance because these are holy men of God, used by God. Because without the church fathers, you don't know the authorship of the Gospels. See that? Now, one thing I wanted to say to Kyrieleison when he said Greek, I forgot to say this. One of the points he was saying, you needed to hear this. He said, in Greek, John Loves Mary can be written over a dozen different ways. In fact, Daniel Wallace, one of the interviews, said that he counted how many possible ways you could say John Loves Mary in Greek, and he gave dozens of ways, not a dozen, several dozen ways. Just John Loves Mary, because in Greek, it's what they call an inflective language. Word order doesn't matter. What matters is the case of the word. Very complex. I'm not going to talk about it. So you'll find in manuscripts, let's say, John Loves Mary written a dozen different ways. It's the same meaning. But the issue is, okay, now that we have, let's say 100 manuscripts, all of them say John Loves Mary. And by the way, I'm giving you a hypothetical. But they say it differently, but it's the same meaning. So we now know what it says, John Loves Mary. But the issue for the textual critic, we know this is what John wrote, John Loves Mary. This hypothetical, just saying. That's clear. But what we want to know is the exact way he wrote it. See, that's the debate. That's the pursuit of textual criticism. So they all say the same thing. So we know that he originally wrote John Loves Mary. No doubt that's what he wrote. There's no difference. But we want to know when John first took pen and wrote, what were the exact words that he wrote? That's where textual criticism comes into play. You understand? This is the point. The point isn't, what did John write here? He wrote John Loves Mary. The point is, how did he write it? And then you have to then examine the age of the manuscript, the quality of the manuscript, the veracity of the manuscript, and see if you have a certain number of very old, reliable copies that all read the same way over against later copies that are not as reliable. Then you're going to say, all right, that's how he wrote it. Do you understand now what the debate is? Something that Shelley Powerless and his gay lovers would never be able to explain? Everyone get it? Sorry, brother. It's a person, because he keeps attacking us.
Hey, I'd never tell you to stop talking about anybody. You talk to anyone the way you want. You
I
got
love
your
you.
own thing, so it
That's
doesn't
why,
bother me.
that's why you're going to be great in the kingdom of heaven, because you have great taste. So now, did you understand the point? Because this is the presentation he gave you in less than an hour is stuff that even people in Bible college don't learn. And he gave it to you for free. And he made it so simple that a bald, handsome stud like me, I was going to say skinnier, I need to lose somebody again, so I'm looking as bad as you, made it simple. You understand? He made it simple. That's why the labor is worthy of his wages. The least you can go is go to his channel, subscribe, and like the videos. That's the very least you can do. So you understand? This is what he's trying to say. John Loves Mary can be written 20 different ways. So they all say the same thing. But the textual critic wants to see, all right, this is what this verse says. Okay. But we want to now know the exact way John wrote it. That's the difference. So, brother, go ahead, continue. Whatever you want to say.
No problem. And I'm just going to end it off here. So a lot of people may say that we don't have the Gospels until hundreds and hundreds of years after the death of Jesus. Why do you guys trust the Bible when you don't have any of the Bible at the earliest times? Well, this again is just another claim of ignorance. So Ignatius of Antioch lived from the time of 35 to 107 AD. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the big three. Now, in basketball, you've got big. This is the big three when it comes to Christianity. When you talk about the big scholars, you're talking about these three that I'm about to bring up. So Ignatius of Antioch, from 35 to 107, Ignatius quotes from the Gospels, and now count them: Matthew, Luke, John, most of Paul's letters, including 2 Timothy, which is sometimes considered a late book. This is why we need the early church fathers. If we go to scholars, they will say 2 Timothy was written way too late, but we have early church fathers that are quoting it before it's dated. This is why we need this, which is sometimes considered a late book. He also uses Acts, Hebrews, James, 1 Peter. Now, he may not have cited anything from Mark, 2 Peter, Thessalonians, Colossians, or 1 to 3 John, but others did. Now, he may have also known the book of Revelations. Now, this is important because Revelations is a book that is supposed to be a later book as well, as he makes reference in Smyrnans 3 to Revelation 1:7. Just imagine this. Ignatius of Antioch, from 35 to 107 AD, quoted from all of those Gospels, epistles, and letters. They had to exist for him to quote from them. Now we have, this man would be Clement of Rome. He would be the Bishop of Rome. Clement of Rome is recognized by the Catholic Church as being the Bishop of Rome from 88 to 99 AD. Though some writers, and I would be included into that, this is where I agree with this. Some writers believe that he may have led the Roman Church during the persecution under Nero shortly after 64 AD. Again, I can't prove it, I just believe it. Clement does not use as much of the New Testament as Ignatius, though he uses the Old Testament a great deal. Now, again, this is why I'm a Cathoxidant, including the apocryphal books. He clearly uses both Romans and Corinthians, which would be appropriate in a letter from Rome to Corinth. He also uses Acts, Titus, Hebrews, James, and 1st to 2nd Peter. So the early church had no problem using the apocryphal books and everything else. So I'm not sure why other people do. Now, Polycarp. If y'all have been on my channel, Polycarp is the man of men. He is the one that I always speak about. The martyrdom of Polycarp it's one of the most amazing stories to read. When he stands there and he says, "Away with the atheists." And now you have to read the martyrdom of Polycarp to understand what I'm saying here. But Polycarp was brought into a Colosseum. He was set on fire, but he did not burn.
Yep.
The Lord preserved him through the fire. This man, Polycarp, he quoted abundantly from the scriptures in his letter to the Philippians. He referred to Matthew, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, and 1 Peter, just to mention a few. Polycarp uses more of the New Testament than most of the other two that I mentioned. But if we just take the three people that I mentioned today, and the books that I've showed you that they've mentioned, they mention 22 books of the New Testament within the first 80 years of Christianity.
There you go. Did you guys hear what he said, right? Within the first century, how many books did they reference and allude to?
22.
Jared, that's within the first century. The apostolic fathers, meaning the disciples of the apostles. So within, as the first century starts winding down and the second century begins, 22 books already alluded to and or referenced. Now, by the way, the Clement of Rome is believed to be the same Clement mentioned by Paul in Philippians 4, verse 3, specifically verse 1 to 3, where he says that he is among those whose names are written in heaven. Now, if you guys were to go to my YouTube channel, I said I'll be opening up the Q&A a little later. Here's the Muratorian canon. So if you, and you guys know the material is yours, so you don't need to ask me. You can use the material in sessions. And I link to other canons. Athanasius' biblical canon, Gregory of Nazianzus' biblical canon. Nazianzus, is that supposed to be Nazianzus? I think I got a typo. Yeah.
Yep.
How's this a typo here? Shoot, man. It's Nazianzus, but anyway, it's here. But in the article, it's corrected. Anyway, Synod of Laodicea's biblical canon. So I give you canon lists. Here's the Muratorian fragment. I'll read it for you. It's dated around 170 AD. 170 AD. Okay? 170 AD. You with me there? This is a second century canon list. Here it is. All right. Here we go. You ready? 170 AD. You ready, guys? Let me enlarge it. And then if you have a few questions for our brother, because I know, are they live now, your guys?
Oh, yeah, probably. Yep.
All right. I'll let you ask him a few questions in the text. Then I'll open up the Q&A if you guys want to come and challenge me, because he's also got a team that he's going to be joining shortly. But let me enlarge it. Here it is, guys. Look what he mentions. It's broken off at the top, at the beginning. It's a manuscript that's broken off. So the copy begins at the midpoint, but you can guess what he's referring to. So it starts, at which nevertheless he was present, and so he placed them in his narrative. That's how it begins. All right. You're going to know what he's talking about. The third book of the Gospel is that according to Luke. Luke, the well-known physician, after the ascension of Christ, when Paul had taken with him as one zealous for the Lord. Look, he's mentioning the books. Composed it in his own name, according to general belief. Yet he himself had not seen the Lord in the flesh. And therefore, as he was able to ascertain events, so indeed he begins to tell the story of the birth of John. The fourth of the Gospels, that of John, one of the disciples. Now, can you guess what the other two books were that he mentioned, but are not part of the manuscript because it's broken off? If he tells you the third book is Luke and the fourth Gospel is John, guess what the other two happen to be, which he mentioned, but that part is broken off. Guess what the other two would be? Matthew and Mark.
Weirdly enough.
You get it? You guys get what he's... So in the mid-second century, he's listing the four Gospels as we know them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We know he would refer to the other two because he says the third gospel is by Luke. That means he's already mentioned the other two. And the fourth gospel is of John. Now watch, let's finish it. To his fellow disciples and bishops who had been urging him to write, he said, now he gives you an ancient tradition of the church, folks. This is a tradition not found in the Gospels, but an oral tradition preserved by the church that they were encouraging John to write a gospel. So what did John the Apostle say? Fast with me from today to 3 days. And what will be revealed to each one? Let us tell it to one another. In the same night, it was revealed to Andrew of the apostles that John should write down all the things in his own name, while all of them should review it. Damn, Gina. You understand what that means? You understand, guys? The ancient tradition passed on by the church was that the other apostles, such as Andrew, encouraged John to write a gospel. They all prayed about it, and Andrew confirmed, go ahead and write it. That means the plural statements, when you read in John, we bear witness of what he writes. There are statements where, I'll give you an example. You have a few minutes, brother, so I can show them this?
For sure, yep.
Here you go. Okay. John 19:35. He who saw this has testified that you also may believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth. This is almost like a third person writing. It may be John writing or third person. If it's third person, the tradition tells us that would be the apostles giving their imprimatur. But watch this one. John 21:22-25. Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. So the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. Now, John may be writing in the third person, but this here, watch here. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is it? What is that to you? This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true. We, see the plural?
Mm-hmm.
We, you see the plural? That means others are now coming to the forefront and giving their imprimatur, writing. We are witnesses to what he's writing, and we're telling you he's telling you the truth. But there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written out, I suppose that the word itself could not contain the books that would be written. Now, if you're wondering who the we are, the Muratorian fragment told you.
Mm-hmm.
It was the apostles.
Mm-hmm.
The apostles, one of them, John, that John should write down all things in his own name, while all of them should review it. Did you guys understand now what the we are? But now let me bring out that implication. That means John was written before 70 AD. All right, but hold on. If he's written before 70 AD, but then we have testimony from folks like Irenaeus that the Gospel of John would have been written during the reign of Domitian, and that's 90 AD. Do we have a contradiction? No. Let me explain how it works. The evidence leads us to conclude that John wrote before 70 AD, but he didn't finish and did not finalize the gospel until shortly before he died in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
You understand that's working, right? When he writes the gospel, the apostles are alive, and they give their imprimatur, their seal of approval, but John finishes off the gospel, final touches, years later, when he died, a natural death, because he was the last of the apostles to survive. That's how you make sense of the facts. And there's actually a statement from John. Now, brother, I hope I'm not holding up, brother. If I am.
No, I'm enjoying this, actually.
And you can upload this to your, if you didn't share it already, so you can have it. There's actually evidence from John that when this was initially written, it was written when the temple was standing. And I got this from Daniel Wallace. Here, let me show you. John 5:2. Look at the present tense of the verb. And Daniel Wallace wrote an article explaining Now notice the present tense. Now in Jerusalem by the sheep gate, there is, not was, a pool called in Hebrew Bethsada, which has 5 porticos. He's writing and saying this pool is still there in Jerusalem. Well, after 70 AD, this pool was buried, right? And the debris, and no one would know its location. But he's saying it's there right now. This shows that he was writing before 70 AD. Now, to blow your mind away even more, recent archaeological excavations in Jerusalem in the 20th century found this pool, and they found it exactly as John described it. It has 5 porticos. Daniel, if the Bible's clear about prostitutes like you being stoned, why are you barking like a little spiritual whore? Shut your pie hole. You don't know the Sabbath. When I do Q&A, come so I can bury you, you son of Satan. But everyone got it? He's writing, he's saying there is a pool right now. But if he's writing after 70 AD, he would have said there was a pool, and archaeology has found this pool. Let me show you. Stupid bastards wants to talk about spiritual bastard, by the way, brother.
And it would have said, and it had 5 porticos, not it has.
Yes.
Right.
It's found. Here it is. They found it. Bethsaida. And they found it, and it exactly has 5 porticos, just like John said. Just like John said. Found it. Let me see. Here's the picture. They found it, folks. That means whoever wrote it knew his Jerusalem geography. Found it. Just like John said. After 70 AD, it was buried. They found it. Right? Bethsaida, they found it. The portico, the pool, found. And it's exactly like John said. So, this is evidence John originally wrote before 70 AD. And the ones who spoke, we bear witness, would be the apostles. So, there you go. But now let's finish the list. Because this brother, I know, takes few questions and he's got to join his friends. Let's finish it. And so, though various elements may be taught in the individual books of the Gospels, nevertheless, this makes no difference to the faith. So notice they're saying the Gospels are not identical, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't change the faith of believers, since by the one sovereign Spirit, all things have been declared in all the Gospels. See? Yeah, there are differences, but it was the Spirit who moved them to write the way they did, and the Spirit wants to include those differences. Concerning the nativity, concerning the passion, concerning the resurrection, concerning the life of his disciples, concerning his twofold coming, Christ will return physically and bodily. The first in loneliness when he was despised, which has taken him as the second glorious and royal power, which is still in the future. Now, how many other books? Let's finish it. What marvel is it then if John so consistently mentions these particular points also in his epistles, saying about himself, what we have seen with our eyes and heard with our ears and our hands have handled, these things we have written to you, quoting 1 John. For in this way he professes himself to be not only an eyewitness and hearer, but also a writer of all the marvelous deeds of the Lord in their order. Moreover, the acts of all the apostles. Look, he just mentioned Acts. 1 John, Acts. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. That's 6 books so far. For most excellent Theophilus, Luke compiled the individual events that took place in his presence, because Luke was writing as an eyewitness, as he plainly shows by omitting the martyrdom of Peter, as well as the departure of Paul from the city of Rome when he journeyed to Spain. Now, Christians, are you asleep? I don't think you caught what he just wrote.
Wow.
Christians, are you asleep or did you wake up? This is stating Luke wrote Acts before Peter was killed, before Paul was released. And that's how Acts ends. Acts 28 ends with Paul in house arrest, awaiting a meeting with Caesar, but we're not told what happened afterwards. Later church tradition says Paul was released from prison and went to Spain. And here it is. Meaning the early church confirms that Acts was written before 64, 65 AD. Because Peter and Paul were martyred after 64, 65 AD. You awake, Christians, especially you in Rumble? And this is for you, brother, to use in your debates, right? Here is a 2nd century fragment giving you a list of books and even dating them. If Luke wrote before Matthew and Mark, and he wrote before Peter was killed, here it says, and Paul was released, because Acts 28, he's still in prison, house prison. He can have visitors. That means Luke and Acts are written around 63, 64 AD. Matthew and Mark would be earlier. So let's finish the list. As for the epistles of Paul, they themselves make clear to those desiring to understand which ones they are, from what place, or for what reason they were sent. So let's add. We already counted 6. Let's count. First of all, to the Corinthians, prohibiting their heretical schisms. Next, to the Galatians, against circumcision. Then to the Romans, he wrote at length, explaining the order or plan of the scriptures, and also that Christ is their principal or main theme. It is necessary for us to discuss these one by one, since the blessed apostle Paul himself, following the example of his predecessor John, writes by name to only 7 churches in the following sequence. Did you catch it? He listed Revelation.
Yep.
When did John write to 7 churches? In Revelation.
Yep.
So let's count. Now we add Revelation. That's 7. Now how many did Paul writes? To the Corinthians first, to the Ephesians second, to the Philippians third, to the Colossians fourth, to the Galatians fifth, to the Thessalonians sixth, to the Romans seventh. It is true that he writes once more to the Corinthians. That's 2 Corinthians. So that's 8 altogether. And to the Thessalonians, that's 9, for the sake of admonition. So 9 and 7, so far now, we got 16 books mentioned. Yet it's clearly recognizable that there's one church spread throughout the whole extent of the earth. What else? For John also in the Apocalypse, already mentioned it, though he writes to 7 churches, nevertheless speaks to all. Paul also wrote out of affection 1 to Philemon, that's 17. 1 to Titus, 18. 2 to Timothy, 20. And these are held sacred. 20 so far. In the esteem of the church, Catholic, for the regulation of ecclesiastical discipline, there is current also an epistle to the Laodiceans. There was a book circulating, supposedly the Laodiceans, but the Christians were not certain Paul wrote it. Another to the Alexandrians, both forged in Paul's name. See, they didn't accept it as Paul. Refute the heresy of Marcion. Marcion sprung up around 150 AD. So if these books are refuting Marcion, that means they could not be written by Paul. See how smart and brilliant the church was? Do you understand? Christians, if you're not listening, these were brilliant, spirit-filled minds. What do I mean? Notice how God is illuminating them. Wait. If Marcion only arose around 150 AD, long after Paul died, then how in the world could Paul have written 2 letters refuting Marcion? These must be forgeries. You see how brilliant they are? You see how brilliant they are, guys? These men were not jokes. They knew their Bible. They knew their history. They didn't have internet. They didn't have software. And they knew the Bible like the back of their hands. And they knew, because the Spirit was guiding them, how to know which books were from the Spirit. Several others which cannot be received into the Catholic Church, for it is not fitting that gall be mixed with honey. So how many books so far? He mentioned 20, right? Okay. Moreover, the Epistle of Jude, that's 21. And 2 of the above mentioned, or bearing the name of John, so that was 1st and 2nd John, 22 books are counter used in the Catholic Church. The Book of Wisdom, written by friends of Solomon. There's the wisdom of Solomon, guys. We receive only the apocalypses of John, that's Revelation. But guys, to your surprise, maybe you didn't know this, there was an apocalypse attributed to Peter. This book was accepted widely by many, and it was more popular than John's Revelation. And it's online. You can read it for free. See? Let's finish it. So he's saying there are churches that accept both John's apocalypse and Peter's. Peter, this apocalypse attributed to him, was actually very popular and was better received than John, but by the grace of the Spirit, it wasn't included because the evidence shows Peter didn't write it. I'm sorry. Then you can look at it and see. Though some of us are not willing that the latter be read in the church. See? We're not willing to read Peter because we're not certain Peter wrote it. Now, if you were listening to yesterday's stream with James, where William came on, he mentioned the shepherd of Hermas. Watch what he says about it. But Hermas, or Hermes that wrote the shepherd, very recently, bam. Now remember, the Muratorian fragment is dated 170 AD. 170 AD. He's saying this book by Hermes was written recently. Therefore, it cannot be from the apostles and their followers. Therefore, it cannot be canon. Hermes wrote the shepherd very recently in our times in the city of Rome, while Bishop Pius, his brother, was occupying the chair of the church of the city of Rome. And therefore, it ought indeed to be read, but it cannot be read publicly, meaning you can read it, but you can't quote it in church as scripture. The people in church, either among the prophets, whose number is complete, or among the apostles, for it is after their time. You see the brilliance? These were not stupid men. They knew their history. They knew their church. They knew their Bible. There you go. So, guys, let's take about 3 or 4 questions to Chris. The link to his YouTube channel, description box. Subscribe, support, pray.